The From Software DLCs tend to be very high quality across the board. Every single one houses amazing types of bosses, areas, level design, and the weapons are also a big portion of that. They're not necessarily the best weapons based on performance, but they tend to be the most creative and the most fun ones to use. But for today, we are going to go over the best weapon for every single DLC, not necessarily the most fun or the most unique one, but it's just going to be based on how well it performs and how useful it is in PvE only. The Dark Souls 1 ARTORIAS of the Abyss DLC did offer a mixed bag when it does come to weapons. You have like some meme options in the 4-pronged plow and the Guardian Tail, but then you have some pretty decent options like the Abyss Greatsword, which is one of the best boss weapons. The Gold Tracer is a nice damaging curve sword that does get bleed with a pretty cool heavy attack, but when it does come to raw DPS, even including the bleed, it's probably going to be outclassed by other curve swords. The Madness Catalyst is probably the most broken thing on this list because it can help just make your spells just do ridiculous amounts of damage, but I kind of just want to talk about regular weapons when it comes to this video, and I think the Obsidian Greatsword is probably going to be the best amongst these options. This Greatsword does get immensely high base damage, but the trade-off being is that it doesn't actually get any scalings. So going into high amounts of strength or dexterity is not going to boost the damage. So maybe like at later New Game Plus iterations, it's not going to be the best thing, but it still can perform pretty well because this thing fully maxed out can do just as much damage as a 40 strength 30 dexterity Claymore, and the Obsidian Greatsword can also be buffed as well. Does get a very similar moveset to the Claymore, specifically one-handed, but when it comes to the two-handed moveset, its heavy attack does serve as a cool AoE attack, which summons a bunch of these fire pillars, which funnily enough don't actually do fire damage. They're mainly doing physical damage and some magic, and they also can do whatever damage that your weapon buff is going to be using as well. So you can put on things like Sunlight Blade or Gold Pine Resin, and you can make that AoE do some lightning damage too. Now the AoE is still pretty slow and obviously does consume a lot of durability, like a lot of other unique types of heavy attacks in this game. So in boss fights, I probably wouldn't bother with it much, but it does have very good utility as a crowd control option when you're surrounded by a whole bunch of trash mobs, or you find some slightly larger enemies like Black Knights. It can break their poise pretty quickly. So I probably wouldn't call it the best greatsword in the game, but it is very easy to upgrade, can do amazing damage without having to spec into your damaging stats, and the heavy attack can make from getting boss to boss an easy experience. Now getting into Dark Souls 2, there are 3 separate DLCs. Starting off with the Crown of the Sunken King DLC. There aren't too many weapons here. I think it came down to the Yorg Spear and the Drake Blood Greatsword. Because the York Spear does have an amazing moveset. It kind of combines like a twin blade and a lance into one, but it's kind of like an awkward in between. Doesn't really get as much damage nor as much counter damage as a regular lance, and it doesn't really have the consistent speeds and low stamina cost that some twin blades might have. So I think the Drake Blood Greatsword is like the obvious pick here, because this is a very solid dexterity scaling greatsword. Actually does get a little bit of split damage in both magic and lightning, and it also can be buffed on top of that. So when paired alongside things like Gold Pine Resin, putting on the Sorcery Clutch Ring and the Lightning Clutch Ring, you can actually get some really high AR out of this thing, because those rings just give you a flat amount of damage, unlike how they worked in the other games. But even its really high AR potential aside, it also gets 140 counter damage, which is actually the highest in the Greatsword class, and it is one of the lightest with really low stamina cost. And it also does get a unique two-handed moveset, to which the moveset itself I don't really care much for, because it's actually slower on average compared to the other types of Greatsword two-handed attacks. But it still is perfectly serviceable. It does actually have some nice variation with the moveset, but I definitely want to have this bad boy power stance, because typically with power stancing weapons, it's going to be pretty expensive on your stats and your stamina cost, but with how little this thing weighs and how low stamina cost it actually is, the power stancing combos aren't that bad. And going into the R1, L1 combos, you can just destroy basically every boss in the entire game. The Crown of the Old Iron King DLC did add some pretty cool and interesting weapons as well, as always. I honestly think this DLC is probably the weakest when it actually does come to weapons based on performance, and probably even uniqueness as well. There obviously are some pretty cool weapons out there, like you get this big ass giant fucking hammer in the Smelter Hammer that just hits like an absolute truck. You get some funny ass attacks. The Majestic Greatsword on power stance can do this sick ass front flip, and it gets a unique moveset just being in the left hand. There are some disappointing options out there though, like the Fume Sword or the Fume Ultra Greatsword. I kind of wish these had some like cool fire based attacks, or some like inherent dark damage with like a unique moveset. They kind of were a little bit lacking. You do have the Aged Smelter Sword, which is pretty much just the worst version of the regular Smelter Sword, but it does actually offer you a pretty cool power stancing combo. But with all that being said, I think the Bewitched Alone Sword is the best one in the DLC. This is one of the highest, if not the highest damaging katana in the game, with some of the most range. Now the trade-off being is that it is going to be a bit slower than the other katanas, be on the heavier side and consume a bit more stamina. But all katanas in this game are incredible because they have pretty quick speeds, this one included, and all get insanely high counter damage. But what the Bewitched Alone Sword also does is have a unique L2, to which involves you stabbing yourself, which yes, this is like the foundation of Seppuku or the Bloodlust skill, but it's probably even better because you actually get a very decent damage boost. Like using this with a regular build, not too many stats. The weapon buff can improve your damage by like upwards of 25%. And you can go ahead and power stance both of these things too, and just melt everything in the game. Now, the obvious downside here is that you are going to take a lot of damage when you do actually go for the buff, but the returns are just undeniable. The Crown of the Ivory King DLC is probably the best DLC in Dark Souls 2 when it does come to the quality of the weapons. It does get a mix-up of some really fun stuff and really powerful things. Things like the Ivory King Ultra Greatsword can be one of the highest damaging Ultra Greatswords, with probably the best moveset and the most range. The obvious downside is probably going to be its durability issue. You get things like Elium Lois, which is actually a decent damaging curve sword that can heal you and allies. You have things like the Bone Fist, which has like the coolest moveset in the entire game. They get to mix up all these cool kicking attacks. You get projectile attacks too. Like, it probably is the most fun weapon in the entire game, but unfortunately it's not the best, because the best is probably going to go to the Ice Rapier. This is not only the best weapon in this DLC, but probably the entire game, because piercing swords in themselves have ridiculously fast combos, very low stamina cost, insane DPS, high counter damage. Like, you literally can't go wrong with piercing swords, and the Ice Rapier is probably just the best amongst them because it just gets the most amount of damage, and it offers a heavy projectile attack too. So you have the utility of hitting at a distance, and you also just get ridiculous DPS. Like, the only downside is you have to farm for it, but once you do, congratulations, you beat the game. Dark Souls 3's Ashes of Ariandel DLC is something that does have some mixed opinions. People just wish it was a bit bigger, maybe some more bosses. But I think the things that people agree on the most when it does come to this DLC is obviously Sister Freda being an amazing boss fight. The PvP arena is really good, and the weapons are also really fun and unique too. Now, the thing is, as good as a lot of these weapons are, I don't think any of these are S tier, maybe like 1 or 2. The Crowcrows is probably the best thrusting sword in the game, but the weapon can be a bit inconsistent with buffs, and thrusting swords tend to just be outclassed by straight swords or curved swords. Things like the Millwood Battle Axe and the Follower Saber are pretty decent options, but they're probably going to be better in PvP. The Rose of Ariandel just made miracle builds even better, and honestly borderline broken, because you can get 30% more damage with them for some reason. But I do think it came down to 2 separate weapons in either the Onyx Blade and the Freda's Great Scythe, which the Onyx Blade is a decent damaging greatsword, gets the exact same moveset as the Claymore, but the thing is, like, a regular dark infused Claymore can just do more damage, unless you do account for the unique buff that the Onyx Blade does get, which can make it do amazing damage depending on who you're fighting, because actually it's doing 3 different damage types when you have the buff active, and being that its weapon art is just a weapon buff, you kind of lose out on the utility of having a damaging based weapon art. So it's good, but I don't think it's the best, and I'd probably still give it to the Freda's Great Scythe, which even this weapon does have some downsides to it. I think it has like the worst scythe moveset, like just the regular one-handed, two-handed light attack combos are just worse than every other scythe because they're just slower, and also does a pretty weird scaling, so you have requirements in almost every single stat, but you only get good scalings in 2 of them, and the intelligence scaling only boosts the magic damage of the skill, because the main weapon is just doing regular physical damage. But that is going to be the reason why it does get for the best weapon in this DLC. This entire combo literally consumes 0 FP. You can spam it over and over again. It stun locks enemies, does really good damage, does some decent frost build up. Like, it's honestly kind of cracked. Like, the only downside is that you might get stuck in a longer animation, so when fighting bosses that cannot be staggered, that don't really give you long openings, it might not be the best thing to use, and you're probably stuck just using like the regular shitty light attack combo. You could potentially use the heavy attack weapon arts in this instance, because it actually does serve as a high damaging AoE attack. So there's lots of utility involved with this weapon, and it can very well just make quick work of a lot of different enemies. So even despite all the downsides that I mentioned, it probably still is deserving of the best weapon from this DLC. The Ringed City DLC is just an absolute masterpiece, and the weapons are a big part of it. Not only does it have some of the best designs and weapons, but a lot of these are extremely powerful too. All the Ringed Knight weapons can be extremely powerful. The Murky Hand Scythe is probably the most broken weapon in PvP. The Demon Scar, albeit not that powerful, probably the most fun weapon in the entire game though. Gale's Greatsword is amazing. The Giant Doors are really fun. The Lothric Warbanner offers one of the best buffs. The Crucifix of the Mad King is one of the most interesting weapons made. But for me, it actually came down to 4 different weapons. These are like all amazing S tier options in this game. It was Leto's Great Hammer, the Frayed Blade, the Ring Knight paired Greatswords, and the Split Leaf Greatsword. Now, the Leto's Great Hammer with the weapon arts can actually make it the highest damaging Great Hammer in the game, and this weapon class is easily one of the best, probably the best strength based weapon class. Now, unfortunately, with its weight, it kind of makes me value some of the other Great Hammers a bit more. The Frayed Blade can be completely broken with its weapon art, because you can spam it over and over again, you can stun lock enemies, and if you're fighting enemies that give you longer openings, and especially if they're weaker to bleed, there are going to be very little weapons out there that could probably do better. The unfortunate part about the Frayed Blade is that it only gets a dexterity requirement, and it gets some of the worst damage out of all the katanas. And as for the Ring Knight paired greatswords, just like every single paired weapon in the game, they're just utterly broken. They just do like such immense amounts of damage, and this is just one of them. And out of all the ultra greatswords, it actually gets the highest amount of hyper armor too, and it has the weapon arts that can serve as an AoE, or just a way to just melt enemies' poise. And the only downside is that the animations for the light attack combos combos are very long. So against some bosses, especially in the DLC, probably not going to be the best thing to use. So honestly, I'm going to go with a split sleeve greatsword as the best weapon in the Ring City, because this one is the best halberd in the game and there's like nothing bad I can say about it. Maybe outside of the fact that it is pretty heavy for a halberd, but like the damage that it gets compared to every other one is just ridiculous. It gets some of the most range, and its weapon art in the Windwheel is honestly insane. It can stun lock enemies, you get amazing amounts of hyper armor, can offer some nice DPS, the follow-up attacks with its heavy and lights can just melt through enemies' poise as well. And on top of all that, it actually can be buffed as well, which makes it very versatile. Like, it's definitely not the most flashy weapon to come out of this DLC, but the thing is, it's a heavy hitting machine. There is probably no FromSoft game that benefited as much of a DLC as Bloodborne did with the Old Hunters, because for certain parts of the game, it was a pretty big jump in terms of quality, specifically things like the bosses, the boss OSTs as well, variation in area aesthetics, sometimes even enemy design, but I think the best one amongst all of those things is probably going to be the weapons in its build creation. Like, we thankfully ended up getting a second blood tinge weapon, and we actually got some arcane weapons as well. Would have been nice if we had some more of those things in the base game, but at least we got them to some capacity. But yeah, almost every single weapon on this list is just amazing. The Beast Hunter Safe can just be an absolute just like R1 spamming machine, and honestly can perform just as well as things like the Sword Cleaver in some instances. The Holy Moonlight Sword is the best arcane weapon in the game. The Church Pick and the Rakuyo are both amazing weapons with really good movesets, and probably are both easily top 5 weapons too. But I think none are better than the Whirligig Saw. Probably to nobody's surprise, this thing is just an absolute boss melting machine. In its transform state, it can just output amazing damage, have quick movesets. You have certain types of attacks that can spin the weapon really quickly and stun lock these enemies. Like, the heavy attack can like flatten enemies to the ground and just do monstrous amounts of damage. The L2 attack can just stun lock all these smaller types of trash mobs. Like, any single time that you fight in these enemies, like, it's basically an automatic GG, because you can just click this one button and they'll all die. And even the untransformed state is still pretty decent as well, as it can offer you some faster types of movesets. But when it just comes to like the cheese potential, there is probably nothing better than the Pizza Cutter. Now, as for Shadow of the ERDTREE, yeah, there are a lot of weapons. Like, when you look at all the other DLCs, like, it's about 10 weapons, maybe 15 max. But in this DLC, there's like over 100 weapons. And it's like the quality of the weapons are that bad either. Like, there's lots of really fun and unique ideas out here. And I'm willing to bet at least 15 of these weapons are like a solid S tier as well. Things like the Fire Knight's Greatsword, Ancient Meteoric All Greatsword, the Falx, the Claws of Night, my personal favorite weapon to come out of the DLC, and the Death Knight's Long Haft Axe. The Great Katanas are amazing, the Milady is really good, the Messmer Soldier Spear, the Euphoria, Carrion Thrusting Shield. So many S tier options, but none were better than the Sword Lance and the Blood Fiend's Arm. Both of these things are utterly broken, but I do think the Blood Fiend's Arm is the better one of the both, as this is probably not only like the best colossal weapon in the game, but it's also the best bleed weapon, the best weapon for charged heavy attacks, the best weapon for guard countering. Like, this thing is just insane. Pairing it with a Faith Boot can make you do like ridiculous amounts of AR. Pairing it with a Bleed Infusion could just make you do over 200 bleed build up per hit, and with its heavy attack, it has like a separate hitbox that also can proc bleed, so you could be doing way more bleed build up with just one charged heavy attack. And this charged heavy attack animation is faster than even like a greatsword charged heavy attack, and you're doing 48 stance damage on top of that. Like, this thing is just ridiculous. Okay, that is that video now done and completed. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. As for the next videos, I do want to make some more Soulsborne related things. I actually wanted to make a curved sword ranking list across all the Souls games, and I still wanted to make my best and worst things about Dark Souls 3 video as well, so definitely do subscribe for those things. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye!